Hi everyone, I hope you're doing well today. I'm just going to see if I can pull up the live chat here. I was trying to get it on my phone last time, it seemed to work out pretty well. But for some reason I'm not seeing it this time. Let's see here. Oh, here we go. Alright, so a few weeks ago, really it's been a month or two, I did a video on obscure books you can read right now. And those are books that you can get right off of Project Gutenberg for free. Project Gutenberg is a online repository of free classic literature, or any book really that's in the public domain. And there was actually a huge number of people that enjoyed that video, and there were one or two people that wanted me to do a follow-up, so I thought, what better time to go over books you can read for free than the current situation. Update on that, we're doing okay here in Washington State. We're not yet in shelter-at-home mode, but for the most part, we're all self-quarantining ourselves, and the stores are still open. Actually, we have a pretty good amount of things left on the shelves, but stock is overall pretty low, and of course TP is still pretty much non-existent at Walmart. So yeah, we're hanging in there. Hope you guys are doing okay as well. Hi Blaj, welcome to the live stream. We're just warming up here. I thought that I would go down my list of books that I think are underrated classics, and then if anyone else has ideas to chime in, and they don't have to necessarily be from Project Gutenberg, but the ones I'll be showing are, so that if anyone is looking for extra things to read and has an ebook reader, this is a good place to get new stuff to read. Actually, I'll just mention that a little quick, so last time I mentioned the Lithium app for Android, which you can use to turn your phone or tablet into a reader. And again, not a sponsor, just an app that I enjoy. But I've been using, or I should say I used to use all the time, my Barnes and Noble Simple Touch Nook. Yeah, apparently I can't spell. And this one was one of the first ebook readers to come out, along with the early version of Kindle. I think these were like $100 something when they first came out, but now they're like really cheap. And I just want to say that mine is still working. I think I got it back in 2010, and it's a nice size. It's about 6 inches this way, and I'm just really happy with it. I can't say it's as fast as like my phone or tablet, but it certainly mimics more of the pace of an actual book. And as you can see, the screen is not too bright or anything. It's pretty much the same as a book page in that respect. The only thing I don't really like about it is it still has like these ads on the front. But if you can get around that, I've uploaded like probably over 100 Project Gutenberg books on it, and for several years I was reading on it almost exclusively. And of course they have newer versions now that light up, but I have the old one that is just the paper white, or I forgot what this is called. E-ink, that's what it is. E-ink by Adobe Technology. So yeah, just want to mention that a lot of these older e-readers are now super cheap, and I've been happy with them. Okay, so underrated classics. I'm going to start off, try to group these by subject, and I've got about 13 here. Again, feel free to chime in with your own ideas, and we can just add to this spreadsheet. And sorry if my voice is a little weird this morning. It's 7 a.m. So just having my coffee here. So The Blithedale Romance by Nathaniel Hawthorne. This was one of the first books by Hawthorne that I read. For whatever reason, I didn't start with The Scarlet Letter. In general, I like to start with the books that sound more interesting to me and then move on from there. The Blithedale Romance is actually semi-autobiographical. It features, well, I'll just read Wikipedia. Its setting is a utopian farming commune based on Brook Farm, of which Hawthorne was a founding member and where he lived in 1841. The novel dramatizes the conflict between the commune's ideals and the members' private desires and romantic rivalries. And then some praise here from Henry James and the darkest of Hawthorne's novels. I don't know if I would say that necessarily. It's very dramatic. So, again, takes place at this commune. And I think when I read it, this was back in 2011, the thing that really stood out to me was the characters. And we just had that discussion the other day about character types. This is a great example of using character types. You've got the narrator, Miles Coverdale, who is kind of a nosy guy, probably getting too much into other people's business. Hollingsworth, who's like the cold philanthropist, and that's actually a type that I think Sir Arthur Conan Doyle used in the Sherlock Holmes series, or at least he referred to that. And then you've got Zenobia, who's the mysterious older woman, and then Priscilla, who is the, I guess, more typical Victorian type female character. It's a bit of a mystery. I would say the ending was a little bit too ambiguous for me. But one thing that makes it really stand out from Hawthorne's other work is it's very readable. It's high on the action, low on the descriptions. So it's a good entry novel, I think, if you're wanting to get into his books, although it is a little more atypical than his other more descriptive tomes. But yeah, I think it's underrated, and of course, as a representation of living in a commune during this time, I think has a kind of a historical interest there. Let's see. So the next one, let's talk about Fanshawe real quick. So didn't want to go into this one in depth, but Fanshawe, also by Nathaniel Hawthorne. This was, I believe, his first book. And I wouldn't say this one's underrated in the sense that it's a great book. In fact, Hawthorne hated it so much he ended up wanting to get all of the copies burned later on. And his wife actually insisted her husband had never written a novel with that title, despite being shown a copy. So, yeah, it's a bit of a melodrama. It very much reads like somebody's first book. But I think it holds some interest just to see the origin of some of Hawthorne's character types. Excuse me. Just having some coffee. And it's also a good example of romanticism. That's going to be a topic for an upcoming video. I want to talk about the Romantics and the Dark Romantics, of which Hawthorne was one of the leading figures in American literature. But again, it's kind of like Charlotte Bronte's The Professor. These earlier novels, obviously very rough, but you can see the beginnings of greatness, and it kind of gives you some encouragement if you're a writer and wanting to see how your great and favorite authors started out. Yeah. So, also, this is a very short book. In fact, this was the very first book I read by him, and then I think Blithedale was my second. And I just think they're good entry points. They're a little bit lighter than some of his other fare. And again, these are all available on Project Gutenberg in a variety of formats. I think Fanshawe is as well, but let me double check here. Yeah, so 29 downloads. One of which was probably me. Yeah. Very short book. So moving on, let's talk about another romantic. Longfellow. So Longfellow and Hawthorne were actually they went to the same college. So you can see some resemblances in certain ways between their writings in terms of the cultural, religious, even stylistic background. Longfellow is most known for his poetry, of course, but he also wrote a book called Hyperion, and I think this is certainly underrated. For those of you who are familiar with Goethe and the German Romantics, of course, you've probably read The Sorrows of Young Werther, which is about a young man who falls in love with someone who's engaged, and of course that doesn't go well, and he ends up falling prey to despair. Hyperion is kind of the same setup. We've got this young man named Paul Fleming who's traveling through Germany and Switzerland and observing the scenery. And then he meets this young lady named Mary Ashburton. And it's kind of I would call it sort of a mirror story to Werther. Troubled, poetic young man searching for peace in the beauty of the countryside falls in love, and it's a very quintessential romantic story, uppercase R romantic. Let's see, I gave it 3 out of 5 stars back in 2013. It certainly is one of those books I would read again, just because of I personally really enjoy the Romantic era, and I think there was some good social commentary in this book. It's not necessarily a huge page turner, but it's a nice pairing with some of these other romantics, and I think he could have written some really great novels if he had continued down that path, but I don't believe he wrote any other ones. Let's double check here. Okay, so Blage says, I would say Rabelais is underrated in general. I know Bloom considers him canon, but he's very rarely discussed. I've read Gargantua and Pantagruel by him. Rabelais, that name rings a bell. Let me pull him up here just so I don't forget. Okay, I bet he is on Project Gutenberg too, so we'll look up that in a moment. And then, hi Sharon, it's good to see you in the chat. Longfellow, yes, so I don't think he wrote any other novel besides Hyperion, but let me check here. Okay, I am so wrong. Okay, wait, there's a category. Okay, sort of wrong. So he wrote 2 novels, another one named Kavanaugh. Interesting. Let's see here. Kavanaugh is a story of a country romance. Besides a character named Kavanaugh, among its characters is a schoolteacher named Mr. Churchill, who has always planned to write a romance, but whose procrastination never allows him to start. Until late in life, he resigns himself to his, quote, destiny. Interesting, okay. Huh. Okay, so this one you can get from a university. Okay, well then I learned something new. Yeah, I do enjoy his poetry quite a bit. I know it's kind of, at this point it's kind of cliche poetry. At least I think a lot of people view it that way. And yet I think there is, I still think he's kind of underrated. Sort of due for a rediscovery, if you will. I was listening to an audiobook of Tales of a Wayside Inn, and I didn't finish it yet, but it's on LibriVox. Side tangent here. So yeah, Tales of a Wayside Inn by Longfellow, read by Peter Yearsley, one of my favorite readers on LibriVox. And what's really cool about this is if you listen to this all the way through, then you get the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere in context. So this set of poems is really a story. There's like this frame story of these friends gathering at this tavern, swapping tales, and then the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere comes into that. And when you listen to it like that, it's really cool. So yeah, I definitely recommend at least what I've listened to this. I think I've listened to about half of it so far. Let's see, Rabelais, the famous toilet humor guy. You know, I have to admit, I haven't read a lot of stuff before probably 1780. It's a huge gap in my reading repertoire. So I need to go back and remedy that. Let me see if I can add. Oops, that was not a success. Do my little hack here. All right. Oops. Let me see real quick if he's on Gutenberg. And he is. Cool. Maybe after the live stream, I'll put links to these in here as well. All right, so we talked about the Romantics. I'm trying to think where we should go from here. Let's go to Edgar Allan Poe, who is kind of segueing from the Romantics to the Dark Romantics. I guess really Hawthorne and Poe are both Dark Romantics. The Murders in the Rue Morgue, the Charles Auguste Dupin series, #1. This is one of the precursor series to the Sherlock Holmes series. So some people have already heard of it that way. I have read it years and years ago, and then I went back and read the first one recently. I really thought it was better the second time around. And it follows a detective, or really, not really a detective, a young man who acts the part of a detective, who has a lot of personality similarities to Sherlock Holmes. And then he has a Watson character who's the narrator. So you can see very much the parallels between Sherlock Holmes and Dupin. But as Sherlock Holmes famously disparages him for, Dupin is more of an armchair detective and doesn't... let's see, I say he visits the scene of the crime, but most of his work is done at home. So, yeah, I think it's a good series to read, not just for the Sherlock Holmes antecedents, but also just the early detective genre is very interesting because it's not self-consciously detective genre. It's the beginnings of it, and yet they're also able to do other things and throw in unexpected elements that nowadays would be like, well, you wouldn't put that in a detective novel, right? But back then, there was no pressure to fall into any specific genre like that. So I think it's a good series. There's 3 books. They're really like long short stories. The Purloined Letter is another one, and The Mystery of Marie Roger. Yeah, but this is the first one. Blush says, Poe's poetry is fantastic. One of my absolute favorite poets. Yeah, I've been going back to some of his poems recently as they show up on Instagram and so forth. And I very much want to go back. I read his stuff when I was about 12 or so, 13. And I think some of it was a bit over my head at the time. But one of my favorite poems is The City in the Sea. And there's a fantastic recording of it by Basil Rathbone. It's a bit dark, but it's truly masterfully written. So, yeah, I love his poetry. Where should we go from here? There's still academic fighting, writes Blaj, over if the orangutan in Poe is showing inner racism or not. Interesting. I hadn't read that interpretation. I mean, it's possible. I had not, like, the last time I read it, it didn't strike me that way. But then maybe I wasn't necessarily looking for subtext. Let's see, so we're kind of made it through the romantics now. Let's switch over to Mark Twain for a moment. I'm trying to segue through the American authors here. Mark Twain, Personal Recollections of Joan of Arc. I was reading about this yesterday because I remember I really enjoyed this novel, being interested in everything Joan of Arc. And they were saying how he considered it like his best work, and critics and so forth didn't think it was very good at all. Let's see here. I thought that for a novelization of a historical figure, I thought it was very well done. And it's completely different than your usual Mark Twain. There's very little of that kind of quintessential Twain humor in it. It's very serious. And of course it features a female character, which is a little different than his usual. I think, again, if you're interested in anything Joan of Arc, I feel like this is an underrated novel. And again, it's one of those I would read again. I felt like it went by very quickly. Now it's telling me there's actually 2 volumes here. So this is volume 1. I think it's narrated by one of her friends, now that I think about it. I think this is first person. Looks like this one actually has some illustrations. That's cool. Yeah, so this is first person by one of the people in her army or friends. Can't remember exactly. Good book to escape into, especially during this time. Let's see here. The Prince and the Pauper. Yeah, I haven't read that one actually, which is pretty sad. I've only read, so I read 3 Twain books. I read Joan of Arc, A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, and the third one was Tom Sawyer. I'm ashamed to say I've never read Huckleberry Finn or Prince and the Pauper, although I will at some point. It's just, I don't often think to read Mark Twain for some reason. I really want to read his autobiographical stuff. I think that would be educational and entertaining. All right, so I'm going to pivot to, let's go ahead and do Sylvie and Bruno here. I think I might have mentioned this in a previous video, possibly. Sylvie and Bruno concluded by Lewis Carroll. So Lewis Carroll, of course, most famous for Alice in Wonderland and Alice Through the Looking Glass. Sylvie and Bruno is definitely obscure. There are not many editions of this book. And I think it's too bad. It's a very original book, let's put it that way, especially for the time period in which it was written. Lewis Carroll being mid to late 1800s. So what is it about? It's about these two children who live in this fantasy world of Outland, and they're actually fairies. And their father gives them this heart-shaped locket, which they're supposed to hold on to, which symbolizes love, right? And then at the same time, there's this parallel story going on in the real world where this Dr. Arthur Forrester falls in love with Lady Muriel, but then she falls in love with somebody else, and it's just a love triangle. Very original story, kind of strange as you can imagine. There are a couple things I really enjoyed about the story. One was the going back and forth between the fantasy world and the real world. If you enjoy that aspect of some of the Narnia books, then this is going to appeal to you for sure. Seeing how those two worlds interplay with each other. I enjoyed also the quirky humor in this one. So it's like Alice in Wonderland, except almost more exaggerated. And there were some really interesting pieces of social commentary in here on the Church of England and just all these real world things that you wouldn't necessarily expect in this kind of book. So it's a little esoteric. I'm not sure that it's going to appeal to everyone, but I thought I'd mention it in case you're a fan of Alice in Wonderland and are looking for something similar. And again, there's also a lot of Lewis Carroll's signature humor with the math and the puns and stuff, so it's kind of entertaining. But don't make the mistake I did. I thought that the first book was the only book, but there's actually two. So be sure to read them back to back, otherwise you might get super confused. Another child's book I wanted to mention, so-called child's book, is The Wizard of Oz. And The Wizard of Oz by Frank Baum. Most people have seen the movie, but I thought the book was actually really good too. Trying to find my latest review here. It's quite a bit different from the movie in some ways. For example, Dorothy doesn't want to go home in the book. What were some other differences? The Cowardly Lion is actually a pretty serious character in the book, unlike the movie. And then it has one of my favorite quotes. "There is no living thing that is not afraid when it faces danger. The true courage is in facing danger when you are afraid." So, really good book, I thought. Again, not going to appeal to everyone, but I thought I'd throw it out there. Moving along, let's see here. I'm going to jump down to 3 Men in a Boat by Jerome K. Jerome. I've seen this one mentioned a few times actually, so I think more people are learning about it. It was pretty much unknown to me until about 6 years ago. This is basically if three guys in the Victorian era were YouTubers and they decided to go on a boating expedition down the river. And it's highly humorous. It's very dated, so keep that in mind. It's not some of the language is pretty dated, but it's also entertaining. It gives you a glimpse of what it was like to live in the Victorian era and take vacations during that time. And it's also on Project Gutenberg. Go back. Okay, so this actually has illustrations. That's cool. So if you like that kind of quaint British humor, this is a book that will probably appeal to you. And there's some genuinely funny scenarios in here. Again, like I said, it's like watching Victorians film a YouTube video. And I would say it's kind of unique for its time because we're talking about, I guess it's basically a sitcom, but a lot of the books written back then, the humor would be more like absurdism and unintentional absurdism, or just, I don't know. This is like intentional absurdity, and I think it kind of stands out among other books of its time. Anthony Trollope. You know, I've never read anything by Anthony Trollope, although he's been on my radar a long time. Another one in that same category was William Thackeray, who was a hero of Charlotte Bronte's. I think, was Trollope the one that wrote Vanity Fair, or was that Thackeray? Okay, so that one was Thackeray. And that one's pretty well known. Trollope wrote The Way We Live Now, I think. Let me double check that. Oh wow, he had a significant output. Chronicles of Barsetshire. Okay, I've definitely heard of that. Dr. Thorne. They did a movie version of Dr. Thorne recently, which I kind of wanted to watch, but never got around to. Interesting. Okay. Just do my hack here. Wait, let me double check. Did he write The Way We Live Now? Yes. Cool. I've kind of taken a detour from British literature in the last 10 years, with a few exceptions like Chesterton and so forth. But I'd like to get back to it sometime. When I mean British literature, I mean like people of that caliber. Trollope, Thackeray, Dickens, of course. Let's see. So okay, the last few here are kind of related. I've got a couple books by Jules Verne, which I think are worth taking a look at if you're a Jules Verne fan, or even if you haven't read any Jules Verne. These are very approachable novels. There's not a ton of science-y stuff in them. The Clipper of the Clouds, also known as Rower the Conqueror, and then its sequel called The Master of the World. These are both basically the same plot as 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, except these take place in the sky with this with this guy Rober who makes a airship. And in the first book, he kidnaps some people and takes them around the world, like Captain Nemo. And then in The Master of the World, he is wreaking havoc on people with his flying machine. So, fun books, not too serious. But I think they're worthy Verne books to check out. I think they're both on Gutenberg. Let me check. Let's see here. So, Rober the Conqueror does exist. That's cool. I mean, just glancing at the first chapter, you can see this is different than some of the more wordy Jules Verne books. And I'm pretty sure Master of the World is also on here because that's where I got it from. So there is an audiobook of sorts. How come oh, here we go. Interesting. So when you search the English title, it comes up in French with English. Okay. Yeah, I thought these were both entertaining books, in spite of being basically the same story as 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. These are going to be more focused on the action side of things and a little bit less on the philosophical musings of Captain Nemo, which I enjoy both of those, honestly. It's just kind of what you're in the mood for at the time. Alright, so after Jules Verne, let's go down to H.G. Wells, also a classic science fiction author. This book isn't necessarily obscure, but I don't think people read it as much as his other ones. It's called The First Men in the Moon. This one is pretty much what it says on the tin. These two guys, a scientist named Cavour and a starving writer named Bedford, basically team up together to go visit the moon, and they find out that there's aliens on the moon, and the aliens have this stuff called, well, wait, let me back up here. This was one of the book reviews I wrote that I find a little hard to follow. Yeah, so Bedford thinks that there's gold on the moon, and Cavour is more interested in learning about the aliens' social structure and so on. I liked this book because it talks about two different social, political groups in the characters of Cavour and Bedford. And what I really liked about it was, I know Wells kind of tended more towards socialism, but he did a good job of painting both characters' pros and cons. And it's a very well-rounded book for that matter. It's not super biased one way or the other. And there's some good humor in here as well. Yeah, that's The First Men in the Moon. Let's see, we've just got one more here, which is White Nights by Dostoevsky. I think this one, oops, wrong color. This is another one that tends to make the rounds in social media in terms of the quote pictures and stuff. I'm not sure how many people actually read it. I thought it was pretty good. It's a story about unrequited love, and it's basically a very Hollywood type story, but very it's written in a very touching way, and you can really empathize with the characters even though the premise of the story is kind of contrived. There's also a movie version of this, an Italian movie version. Let me see if I can find it here. Film adaptations. Yeah, so this is the one that I've seen. It's a black and white Italian film adaptation of the novel. And I think last time I knew you could watch it on YouTube. I don't know if it's still on there. I thought it was a pretty good movie. Pretty good adaptation. Obviously a little different being set in Italy versus Russia. But same idea. So if you're looking for something to watch or read, I do recommend that. Blage says, Carlo Goldoni is an underrated playwright. Again, part of canon, but mostly forgotten. The Servant of Two Masters being his magnum opus, and the only work I've read. Oops, Carlo Goldoni was an Italian playwright and librettist from the Republic of Venice, 18th century. His works include some of Italy's most famous and best-loved plays. Audiences have admired the plays of Goldoni for their ingenious mix of wit and honesty. Yeah, again, I haven't really read a lot prior to this century. But that's good to know. I'm going to put that on the list for people to check out. I wonder if he's on Gutenberg. And he is. Cool. I'm trying to get more into the play genre. I have a book of Ibsen to read, which I was planning to do earlier this year. It just didn't happen. I really have enjoyed the play genre. I think I've mentioned it before, but Arthur Miller was my introduction to that. And of course, I've read a little bit of Shakespeare. I'm not a huge Shakespeare fan, to be honest. But I do appreciate the format, and I think it's there's a lot of power in the play because there's so much left out, right? There's going to be a lot left to interpretation. Let's see. So that pretty much concludes my list. Did you guys have any other thoughts or suggestions? Maybe I'll just mention I finally finished reading Silence by Shusaku Endo last night. Stayed up kind of late, which I'm now regretting. Not really. When I get into a book, I try to finish it as soon as possible. It was a very difficult book. Maybe I'll pull it up here so we have a visual guide. Yeah, so very difficult book to read. Going to be even harder to review. The copy that I have from the library has some questions in the back for book clubs, so I might actually use that for my video format. I thought that by reading it, I would get a clearer understanding of what the author intended and all that sort of thing. But after reading it, I thought it was even more ambiguous than I had heard from other people. So it's going to be a fun one to review, and I hope to get that out maybe this weekend. Maybe I'll film it a little later today. We'll see. It's probably going to be a long video. I might try to cut it down to fewer videos, because there's a lot you could say about how it was written, how the characters start out and how they change. You could talk about the history in and of itself. I don't know. And of course the ending, of course, there's... So, yeah. It was one of the most horrific books I've ever read, and I don't mean because of the content, because it was actually pretty restrained in its descriptions. But it's psychologically horrifying, let's put it that way. So, wonderful stuff to be reading right now. Would not necessarily recommend for quarantine time. Lope de Vega. Spanish plays. Let me look that one up. Lope Felix de Vega y Carpio was a Spanish playwright, poet, novelist, and marine. He was one of the key figures in the Spanish golden age of Baroque literature. Interesting. I love it when, so wait, do they mean... Okay, so they do mean the marine as the Navy. I always think it's cool when Navy, or I should say just seagoing people in general, write books about that. Maybe I'll go ahead and mention someone I could have mentioned earlier. Frederick Marryat. This is another guy who was a contemporary of Dickens, and I think they were like mutual fans of each other. He wrote a lot of books about the Royal Navy before it was a genre. And I think I've read Percival Keene, and I've read Mr. Midshipman Easy. I think those are the two I read. Anyway, pretty prolific output. I would say that it's fascinating from the perspective of somebody, I should say it's fascinating to read the perspective of somebody who lived through those actual events and, working in the Navy. I would say his writing style is not as good as Dickens or others of his era, so it kind of discouraged me from reading more by him. But this will definitely be interesting to people who want to see the progression of Royal Navy fiction. Okay, Blage writes, last one is Karl Kraus, German writer, The Last Days of Humankind, which is absurdly long for a play. Last Days of Mankind, Karl Kraus, his satirical masterpiece of World War I. Oh, okay. Looks like you can actually read it online. Huh. I bet that would be really interesting. I've been sort of getting into the World War I stuff in the last few years because of Lawrence of Arabia. Let me add that one here. All right, so I'll probably end this at 8. In the meantime, if you guys have any questions or things you want to talk about, I'm going to hang out here for another 10 minutes or so. Just let me know in the chat. I do enjoy finding these obscure books because I think that when it comes to literature, we often go back to the same list, which we find, on either from the school or from news outlets. There's certain books that, for good reason, tend to be more well-known, but that doesn't mean that there aren't some gems to be found among the authors' lesser-known works, or even authors that don't get read as much. So that's what I love about Project Gutenberg, is it's opened all of that up. And not only that, but it's presented it in a very egalitarian way, if that makes sense. Like, if you go on Gutenberg, it's not like, oh, here, read Dickens or Jane Austen. It's like, no, you can actually just go browse the catalog and everybody's more or less equal here. So obviously they're going to have more books by Dickens and Austen, but yeah, I just really enjoy this. I think it's something we don't want to take for granted. World War I poetry, yeah. I have a book that's a small collection of poetry. I think I mentioned it in one of the previous videos in the nonfiction bookshelf tour. It is really heartbreaking. I think the poems that really hit me the hardest were those by, what's his name? Kipling? And his were very short, but they said so much. My son was killed while laughing at some jest. I would I knew what it was, and it might serve me in a time when jests are few. I mean, wow, 2 lines just say so much, right? There's actually a really good film called My Boy Jack, which is about that very topic. It's based on, well, the title is from a poem of the same name. But the film stars, of all people, Daniel Radcliffe. It's very depressing, but very well done. Wow, it's already over 10 years old. I can't believe it. Yeah, I agree, Blanche. We tend to talk about the same books over and over. And I mean, it's good to have a common set of books that we can go to, but it ends up being this loop, right? We want to get out of that loop, and not only will it be good for us just in terms of education, but when we read these more obscure works, we get a more well-rounded sense of what that time was like, you know? And it just like if you were to read one author from the 21st century, they're not going to be this blanket representation of everybody, right? So I think it's good to expand your horizons. And you'll find a lot of surprises. Like, I think I mentioned in the last live stream or the last video on this topic, but Charles Brockden Brown, again, one of those people that completely changes your perceptions of what writing was like in a certain time period. Different than Cooper or, you know, these other more refined authors, refined in the sense of like not showing the nitty gritty. Yeah, super interesting though. In Memoriam by Ewart Allen McIntosh. Excuse me. Oh man, this seems like a real tearjerker. So you were David's father, and he was your only son, and the new cut peats are rotting, and the work is left undone, because of an old man weeping, just an old man in pain, for David, his son David, that will not come again. Oh man. It reminds me of a song by Tyler Joseph of 21 Pilots. One of his, again, obscure songs. It's called Tonight, and it's really dark, so I'm not saying I recommend it necessarily, but it's about, oh man, the lyrics. It's like a World War I poem. Let's see if I can pull it up here. The young boy wants to move ahead, and the old man sings rewind. I wonder when in this timeline we'll break to the other side. Maybe there's a span of time when we feel we're neither nor, not wanting to go back again and not wanting to go forth. The old man sits all by himself and thinks of better years, when he used to believe in stars and would dream away his fears. The young boy moves so fast he doesn't see the stars above, and all his dreams are crushed by old men who didn't dream enough. Yeah, it's pretty dark. Oh shoot, my mouse batteries are out. So it must be a hint to finish the live stream on such a cheerful note. So sorry about that, but no, actually this is really good. It'd be interesting to do a episode maybe on World War I literature when I've read a few more books, and we could throw in some poetry as well. Blosh says, I love Enlightenment writers. They're doing things you don't see done anymore. Roasting each other through fiction. You know, that's so true. I mean, it's like that era, you see it in the Founding Fathers and their letters to and about each other. It's a different world, although not really so different. I mean, it's like the original social media. Yeah. Well, I appreciate everybody hanging out for this live stream. Yeah, I got some new batteries here, so we're okay. Yeah, this was super fun. I hope this was helpful to somebody. Hope you have some ideas of things to read. If you have any ideas for future live streams, let me know. I like to do more open-ended topics for these because then it just makes it more interactive and less boring for myself. Not that these are boring, I just like having that interaction. It just makes it more interesting and really more well-rounded than if I'm just spewing off stuff from one perspective. Yeah, so I'm gonna wrap it up here. Thanks for watching, and hope to see you next time.